Front Royal train station here in Front Royal, Virginia, the county seat of Warren County. We're again joined by James Taub, a World War I historian, and we're here today at the train station to talk more about some of the home efforts to the fronts in France during World War I. Now, one of the things that this area is best known for is the horse country. Nearby, a few miles from here, is the oldest horse show in the world, the Upperville Colton Horse Show. We also, in this neck of the woods, have one of the oldest public fox hunting groups, the Piedmont Foxhounds. And so, for centuries, this area has already had a great reputation for both horse flesh, but also horse breeders and horse owners as well. So in the early 1900s, it's not a surprise that when remount stations, remount depots are being established at already existing places like Fort Hill in Montana and Fort Reno in Oklahoma, but a brand new facility is built just outside of Front Royal here in Virginia to take advantage of the amazing horse flesh that's in the Shenandoah Valley, the Loudoun Valley, and nearby areas. Now, by 1915, the Front Royal Remount Depot is up and running, and in its inaugural address, there's actually wording that the Front Royal Remount Depot is specifically made to raise, to train, to quarantine, and to get equine, so horses and mules, even some war dogs, from Virginia to the Eastern Front. So they're already thinking about the Remount Depot as being a tool for American forces to get horsepower over to the east. And so we very quickly see horses from Virginia actually being in Britain and then France directly as well. The Front Royal Remount Depot was a 500-stall barn where they would collect these horses and these mules from the surrounding countryside, so surrounding owners would be able to sell their horses in and get them checked out, and then they'd be collected here at the train station, put on carts, and then headed down to Newport News, where we had the embarkation route. Now, in Newport News, they actually had a 77-acre facility where many of these, tens of thousands of horses were collected before going over. And it's one thing that I think a lot of people take for granted now is just how much horsepower was necessary during World War I. Whether you were trying to ship food into the troops, whether you were trying to get airplane parts to the hangars, you needed mules, donkeys, horses to get objects from point A to point B. But you also still had a small number of cavalry horses being used at the time too. So you needed horses that could be drafts, but could also be smart, gun-safe horses to get some of these officers from point A to point B. One of the biggest hurdles they encountered, though, was from America to France, was the bottleneck of sea tonnage that they encountered getting across the Atlantic. Because the European powers, the Allies, were in such need for human soldiers, there was often, a discussion of, do we send the horses so they can pull the material, or do we send the soldiers to help fighting at the front? And so by the time horses or people got to France, what did they find when they got there?
Yeah, by the time the soldiers, as well as the many animals the United States sent over get to the front, they're going to be arriving in what is basically an incredibly war-torn landscape, not only in terms of the front being shifted, the front being churned up, but as well in the rear areas, France and Belgium are completely depleted countries. They're on their last legs in terms of animals, in terms of livestock, in terms of all of the above. One of the biggest things the United States does is help replenish livestock in France and Belgium after the war, because most of it has been slaughtered for the war effort. As well, the United States is going to be sending over lots of fodder, not only for the American horses, but for the horses of all the Allies serving on the Western Front, to the point that there are still invasive species of grass going in France that is a complete result of American horses and American fodder being sent over to France. And you'll see them in specifically positions where the American troops were stationed. Of course, you'd also, as you mentioned, you had dogs. Dogs were going over not only as to serve for medical reasons, for safety reasons, bomb disposal, all of that, but also as unit mascots. Probably one of the most famous ones is Sergeant Stubby, who came out of a Connecticut unit. But there's plenty of other reasons. World War I is the first modern war, but in many ways it's still an old war because horses are still the primary mode of transportation. You see artillery being pulled by trucks and tractors, but the vast majority are still going to be pulled by horses. Wagons are still going to be pulled by horses.
Especially in places where you see roadways being torn up, or where you see some of the difficult terrain where vehicles are not yet able to get to those places, but horses still can. One of the things we see a lot in World War I is this trench warfare, and we have this idea, you get trench foot, you're stuck in mud for months at a time. And we actually had horses dealing with the same conditions as a lot of these soldiers at the time.
Absolutely. And you would see cavalry charges all through the end of the war. There's several Victoria Crosses won by British soldiers at the last few months of the war for actions with cavalry charges. The United States doesn't have a very heavy cavalry presence just due to the nature of the area they're fighting in, but it doesn't die out. There's cavalry is still a presence, cavalry is still a force as the war enters this very mobile stage in the end. And as you pointed out, horses suffer the same fate in many times as the men and women who are serving in the war.
And then after the war, we know that the AEF that owned the horses on European soil, the American horses at the time, by the end of the war, was about 60,000 equines that were American owned in Europe at the time. But, of course, the Army doesn't want to have to ship all of those horses back across to the continent. And so a lot of those equines that survived the war end up seeding some of these diminished breeds that we saw in Europe because their numbers had been so far depleted. So of the 60,000 that remained after the war, we know that most of them stayed in Europe, apart from the personally owned horses that would belong to cavalry officers who had brought their own equines over. It's also tremendous that after the war, we see these remount depots in America continuing. And in fact, the Front Royal Remount Depot becomes a center for horse breeding in the Virginia Piedmont. So we have local breeders like Alexander McKay Smith who not only purchase stallions from the depot, but then also sell foals and colts back to encourage the breeding program that creates some of the excellent breeds that we see today, some of the excellent bloodlines that we still see on racetracks and steeplechases, etc. today. So there's a great legacy that the Remount Depot has, even though it ended up closing in '48. Now, one of the other interesting things tying Front Royal to World War I is actually General Pershing's 2 of his horses ended up living at the Remount Depot, retiring there, and are buried there today as well. So kind of a fun international tagline.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it's important, again, that we think all about the manpower and the women power that was involved in the First World War, but, the animals suffered as much, if not more, in many of the cases, and finding these small areas that even today it doesn't exist anymore, you could see the power that the industry, in this case the equine industry, has in these towns and these regions, and how important it was to Northern Virginia.
And we're going to tell another story here in Front Royal in just a few minutes, talking more about the home front and the local efforts to support the World War I troops.